She should be any minute. Good morning. Welcome back to our world travelers. We've got several who have been out and about, including John here. We're glad to have you. We have been making a trail through the New Testament, and we've been looking at Paul's letters. We looked at Paul's journeys last week, and today we're going to look at Paul's letters. This is just a survey. We're not going to take the time. We don't have the time to look at every last minute detail. But for most of us here, we're already very familiar with Paul's letters. However, I think sometimes it's good to take a bird's eye view and see the big picture. And that's the whole idea behind this Bible survey. When you look at the books of the New Testament from Matthew to Revelation, you've got 27 books. And we've already surveyed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels. Took a few sessions with those. We looked at the book of Acts in 3 sessions. And here we are now wanting to talk about Paul's letters. If I wanted to read about Paul's journeys, where would I go in the book of Acts? The second half of Acts, chapter 13 through 28. That's where Paul begins his missionary journeys. And what's really neat is that there's parallels between what Paul says in his letters and some of the details that are provided for us in the book of Acts. Isn't that helpful? Isn't that useful? Was Acts written so that it would correspond perfectly with everything Paul wrote in his letters? Or vice versa? Did Paul and Luke get together and say, hey, let's choreograph how we present information? No, and it gets messy sometimes where information's left out and we would like to know more. We'd like to know exactly how some things transpired, but we don't. That's something to keep in mind as we go through the letters. They have a lot of correspondence with each other. But it's sometimes difficult to know exactly what happened. The backstory is just not there. Paul's letters, New Testament. How many letters did he write? We often say 13 letters. And they are from Romans to Philemon. Those are Paul's letters. What about all these others? So next week, we're going to look at Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, Jude. Who wrote the book of James? James. Who wrote 1st and 2nd Peter? Well, Peter. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude. The person whose name is on the book, he's the one who wrote the book. That's not true of Paul's letters. And that's something to keep in mind. Something else I like to talk about whenever we're looking at Paul's letters in general is why they're arranged the way they are. And they're in 2 groups. Romans to Philemon has 2 groups of Pauline letters. The letters written to churches, and I think we're already familiar with this. The letters written to churches immediately followed by the letters written to individuals. So in this case, 1st and 2nd Timothy, who wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy? Well, Paul did. 1st and 2nd Peter, Peter wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. But in the case of these letters, Timothy. I'm just messing with you, that's all. Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, those books that bear other people's names. That's something to keep in mind. I think most of us probably take that knowledge for granted. Yeah, we know that. We already are well aware of that. Why this order? We see the separation between letters to churches and letters to individuals, but why does Romans come first? Why is 2nd Thessalonians last in that separation of letters to churches? Length. All right, so are you saying that Paul didn't write Romans first? He did not write Romans first. Normally, when you're reading a series of books, you want to read them in the order that they were written. So when you're reading 7 Harry Potter books, actually 8, because part 7 is 2 books. They kind of snuck that in there, didn't they? You have to buy 8 books. Oh, okay. It was just the big, humongous book. And I still remember my wife reading those every day they came out. She would stay up all night long. One time, I think it was book 6, maybe it was book 7. She was sick. I guess it was book 7 because you wanted to finish the whole series. And she could not wait to read that. And I remember talking to my grandfather years ago when J.R.R. Tolkien was publishing his Ring cycle, his trilogy. My grandfather, as a young man, was anxious to read the brand spanking new books. Do we get excited when we come to God's Word, when we're ready to read? And of course, these are much smaller, much shorter, not for entertainment. That's not their purpose, but they are extremely important for our souls. Romans was not written first, but it is the longest of Paul's letters, and that's why it heads the list. 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Fortunately, 1 Corinthians is a little bit longer than 2 Corinthians. Otherwise, I guess we would be teaching our kids Romans, 2nd and 1 Corinthians. That wouldn't work. And it's a happy coincidence that 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1 Corinthians is a little bit longer. What is interesting is Ephesians is actually a little bit longer than Galatians. So that's out of order, but it's close enough. You're definitely getting shorter and shorter with these various letters. So, if Romans wasn't the first letter, which one was? We want to read them in order. If we wanted to read them in order, what book would we start with? Is it important for us to know the chronological order of Paul's letters? I'm going to suggest that it is. It is important. And it's also important that we know not only when Paul wrote them, but where he was when he wrote them. All of these letters are situational. They're written to churches, and they are situational. What does that mean? How many syllables is that? Situational. 5! I guess it's a fancy word. What does that mean? When Paul wrote Romans, was he just following a boilerplate set of instructions, and I write this to all the churches exactly? He's addressing situations, unique situations. There's a lot of overlap between them. Even Romans, which is considered to be Paul's greatest letter, it's no more important than any of the others, we would argue. But it is grand, it is the longest of them. So which one comes first? There's debate. Many would suggest that Galatians was written first. That may or may not be true. And there are some reasons for why people think that. It's based on what's inside Galatians. We're not going to talk a lot about dates, when this was written and when that was written. But one of the key dates we need to know is Jesus' crucifixion. And I would contend it would be AD 30. Some would say AD 33. That's fine. But thereabouts. The Jerusalem Council that we talked about last week, the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 is 20 years later, around AD 50. I hope that's easy to remember. The Jerusalem Council recorded in Acts 15, AD 50. Galatians was probably written shortly before the Jerusalem Council. And the reason why it is supposed is because he doesn't talk about what the Jerusalem Council discussed, even though he's dealing with some of those very issues. That's speculative. That may not be correct. Paul may have said, I'm not going to write about that. Another possibility is that he wrote Galatians when he wrote Romans. That again is speculation. It'd be nice if Paul said, here's my first letter, here's my second letter. This is when I wrote it, this is where I was when I wrote it. That wasn't his focus. He was just writing letters to churches. Why do sometimes people say, he probably wrote Galatians and Romans at the same time? Again, that's speculation, but why? Because they talk about a lot of the same issues. Justification by faith, primarily. If Galatians is first, great. But most definitely, the earliest letters besides Galatians are 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. How many journeys did Paul go on, we say, as we read Acts 13 through 28? How many? 3. And then there is also a 4th journey, Paul's journey to Rome, although he didn't go as a free man, did he? He went as a prisoner. We'll talk about that a little bit. We ran out of time last week. I know that's a big surprise to all of you. Trying to cram all this information, this survey material into one class. You can't get sidetracked, and unfortunately, I get sidetracked. All right, we like to talk about 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, but 2 Timothy is actually Paul's last letter. 1 Timothy and Titus would have been written in close proximity to each other, time-wise. 1 Timothy and Titus, what do they have in common with each other? 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1. Why do we turn to those passages? Elders, the qualifications of elders. And then 1 Timothy 3 also talks about the qualifications of deacons. Those letters were written at the same time. We'll talk about that. But Paul makes it very obvious in 2 Timothy that this is his last letter. He's about to die. And it's kind of depressing. And yet, what does he say in 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 8? I'm ready to be poured out as a drink offering. The time of my departure has come. But I have fought a good fight. I have finished the course. I've kept the faith. Very triumphant there at the end. I moved Philemon next to Colossians. Did you see that? Let me do it again. Let me do that again. Oh, I went too far. You like that? You like that? All right. Why is Colossians next to Philemon? Because the church met in the home of Philemon. And the little letter, Philemon, was written most definitely at the same time as Colossians. And when we studied Colossians, we studied it during the pandemic, and we also did a little bit back there, but Colossians and Philemon would have been together. All right. So here we are looking at some of these letters. Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. If Galatians was written at the same time as 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, early, what do we sometimes call Paul's first 3 letters then? Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. They are referred to as Paul's early letters. That's brilliant, isn't it? Just looking at them together, they're referred to as Paul's early letters. What about 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans? When they're grouped together, those 3 letters, they are called Paul's great letters. Does that mean they're greater in importance? Just like the minor prophets aren't any less important than the major prophets. These are just longer, and they have some lofty truths in them, but all of them do. All right, what about this next group? Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, and throw in Philemon as well. What are these letters referred to as collectively? The prison letters, or the term epistle, the prison epistles. I like to use the word letter as opposed to epistle, mainly because that's just one more stumbling block for a lot of people. What is an epistle? Some people will say, well, that's a fancy word for a letter, and that would be correct. Some people might say that's an apostle's wife, which isn't correct. I'm just teasing. I think that's just a preacher's joke. What about 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy? What are they sometimes called? In the literature, what you'll see is the term the pastoral epistles. And what are they meaning by that? These letters are written to preachers. Are they written to pastors? No, they are not. They're written to preachers. And we could justify that and say, well, they're writing about the pastors of the church, otherwise known as elders, otherwise known as shepherds. A lot of times we'll just call them letters written to preachers. But the preacher letters hasn't really caught on. That's not really how we refer to them. If you're saying, hey, I can't remember all this, well, that's what I wrote the book for. That's what the Bible survey is all about, to help remind us of a lot of these things, because this is important. We do need to know this. All right, 1st, 2nd, 3rd missionary journeys, Paul's journey to Rome. If I wanted to read about Paul's first missionary journey, I would go to Acts chapters 13 and 14. What's next? What's Acts 15? The Jerusalem Council. In what year? 50. 8049, 8050, thereabouts. How many letters, this is a trick question, how many letters did Paul write on his first missionary journey? None. Zero. Goose egg, or as you might say, ostrich egg. Did y'all eat ostrich eggs? No. Oh, that's so disappointing. So you have Paul not writing any letters on his first missionary journey. Why am I emphasizing that? Because I think it's important to know when Paul wrote these letters. What about his second journey? He wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians during his second missionary journey. And those are the only letters he wrote on the second journey. Then he's going to write a whole bunch on the third journey. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, not in that order. and we'll walk through that a little bit. Here is a map of Paul's first missionary journey. Where's Thessalonica? He doesn't even go to Thessalonica on his first missionary journey. That's going to be in Europe, across the Aegean Sea, heading northwest of this map. Where do you see Paul going primarily on his first missionary journey? What region? Galatia. Doesn't that make sense then that probably Paul wrote Galatians between the first and second missionary journeys? Because he had just gone through Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, and then went to Galatia, and there's a series of churches there. Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and Antioch of Pisidia, as opposed to Antioch of Syria, which is north of Jerusalem. So you've got these 4 cities, you've got these 4 areas where that all are part of Galatia, this Roman region, not exactly a province, but it's a region. Doesn't it make sense then that Paul, after he heads back to Antioch of Syria, reports to the churches, he would write Galatians? Then, most likely, you have the Jerusalem Council after he's written Galatians. That's the speculation. And it may be in 50 years from now, what we've written in books, what we've talked about in Bible classes, Christians in 50 years from now are going to say, we are so much more enlightened than those folks in the early 21st century. Ha ha. They thought Paul wrote Galatians between his first and second missionary journeys, but we're so much smarter than they are. And that's just the way it is. That's the way of the world. When Paul began his second missionary journey, he made a beeline to those same churches again. Paul went to Galatia and then went back through Galatia on his way back to Syria, Antioch of Syria. On the start of his second missionary journey, which is on the map here, that's exactly what Paul did again. He went to Galatia. Why? Why did he go there on his way back and then go there at the start of his journey? He bypassed Cyprus. Why did he want to be with the Christians there in Galatia? Basically a third time. What was he doing when he went there? Acts 14, excuse me. This is the end of the first missionary journey. This is verse 21 of Acts 14. This is the end of the first journey. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, churches in Galatia. So they had been to Derbe, and now they're going to these other churches, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord whom they had believed. And then he travels back to Galatia. So why did Paul go back to these Galatian churches so much? It's the same reason why when you plant your crepe myrtle tree, you douse it with water those first few months because you want it to grow. You want it to take root. That's what Paul wants for these churches, for them to really be strong from the start. Does everything go perfectly for the Galatian churches? Well, you know Galatians. You know they have some pretty serious issues they have to deal with. All right, do you see Thessalonica on this journey of this map of Paul's second missionary journey? It's up here. So there's Asia. He crosses the Aegean Sea and makes his way to, that's the coastal city of Neapolis. There's Philippi, and then he makes his way to Thessalonica. Thessalonica, Berea. He goes down into the southern region of Greece, which is Achaia, and he's just beaten up. We talked about that a little bit last week. Thessalonica, Paul planted a church. We know that from 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. If you're reading Acts 16, if you're reading Acts 17, do you think to yourself, yeah, Paul established a church here in Thessalonica? He's persecuted. He's beat up in Thessalonica, neighboring Berea. So you read Acts, it looks like he didn't establish a church at all. But you read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, he obviously did in the midst of much distress. Paul, where does he go after he leaves the northern region of Greece, which is Macedonia? Where does he go, according to the map, according to your knowledge? Achaia. He goes to the southern region of Greece, goes to Athens in Acts 17, and then he goes to Corinth in Acts 18, and according to Acts 18, he is there for a year and a half. He is in Corinth on his second missionary journey for a year and a half. Wouldn't that be a great time to write some letters? Doesn't it make sense when you look at the map and you see Corinth in relation to Thessalonica? Obviously, it's going to be easy for Paul to write 1 Thessalonians. I'm not wanting to confuse you. He wrote 1 Thessalonians from Corinth, sends it by way of messenger. He writes 2 Thessalonians soon afterwards from Corinth. I hope that will help us in our future study to be able to chronologically put together when did Paul write, where did he write from, because it's important. Paul was finally at a place where there wasn't a bunch of turmoil like he experienced in Thessalonica. He's able to spend some time writing. I know it's easy for us to say, well, Paul's an apostle, he's inspired. But when you sit down to write, don't you need time? Don't you need to reflect and maybe even do research if you're doing a research paper or something like that? It makes sense that he would have a year and a half in Corinth, some calmness, even though it wasn't always smooth sailing there in Corinth. I hope that helps us. Here is Paul's third missionary journey. I'm going to go back to the second journey real quick. You see Ephesus here? And I know it's a little hard to see, but what Paul did is he went to Galatia, he goes up into Europe, and then there's the northern part of Greece, Macedonia, the southern part of Greece, Achaia. He briefly goes to Ephesus. You see, it's kind of on the port, a port city, and then he makes his way quickly back to Jerusalem. Makes his way quickly to get to Jerusalem, and he promises the Ephesian church that's already been established. He didn't establish it. He says, I'm coming back just as soon as I can. And he does. He goes back to Ephesus as quickly as he can. And how long does he stay at Ephesus? Not a year and a half like he did at Corinth on the second journey. On the third journey, Paul stayed at Ephesus. On the third journey, he stayed at Ephesus for how many years? 3 years. Is that a good time to be writing some letters? You bet. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians while at Ephesus on his third missionary journey. What happened? Shane, what happened? Paul's there minding his own business in Ephesus. He's working with the church there, strengthening them tremendously, no doubt, based on what he wrote to them in the future letter. What does he get in the mail? He gets some reports. He gets some people who actually come to him in Corinth, and he also gets a document of questions from the Corinthians. So the documents of questions, does it mention any serious problems they're having back in Corinth? No, it doesn't. The questions don't. But when he has a person come from Corinth to say, hey, Paul, I need to have a talk to you about the work in Corinth. We got problems. And what Paul does is he addresses the really serious issues in the first 6 chapters of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. And then he says, now, chapter 7 through 15, concerning the things of which you wrote, let's talk about those. When the Corinthians get this letter from Paul, oh boy, we got mail, we got a letter from Paul, let's read it. And he starts talking to them about all the things that they didn't write to him about. He is tearing the hide off of them, saying, you knuckleheads, why are you acting this way? In the first 6 chapters, they must have been pretty shocked. And they weren't too happy with members of Chloe's household. But does that make sense? You're looking at the Aegean Sea. Now, Paul didn't make the trip from Ephesus to Corinth to bring them 1 Corinthians. What was Paul's plan? While he's at Ephesus, what was his original plan? We know this from the letters. What did Paul want to do when he left Ephesus? He wanted to go to Corinth. But because 1 Corinthians was so scathing, he said, no, I better not. I better not go there directly. I need to see how they respond to the letter. Why couldn't Paul just let the Corinthian church send him a text message or an email and say, okay, we got the letter and we're repenting? They had to wait. Paul, why didn't Jesus appear to Paul and say, Paul, your letter has been well received in Corinth? That I don't know. But Paul's a human being, and we need to understand his apprehension, his concern. And he says, you know what? This is what I'm going to do instead. Where does he go? From Ephesus instead. I've got it on the map there. He goes to Thessalonica. Actually, let me correct that. He goes to Macedonia. We don't know for sure where Paul went. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9 with me. What is I'll say this. What is Paul's main purpose behind 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9? We're talking about 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. What is it all about? Take a look at it and remind yourself if you need to. All right, the collection for the needy saints in Jerusalem. By the way, this collection is not talked about in the book of Acts at all. There is another collection that helped needy saints in Jerusalem from Gentiles, but this is a totally different one. Take a look at 2 Corinthians 9, and he says, verse 4, otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, blah, blah, blah. He starts talking about the Macedonians in these 2 chapters. He also talks about how generous the Macedonians were in these 2 chapters. Does that make sense? Because when Paul writes 2 Corinthians, where is he? In Macedonia. Probably Thessalonica. I don't know that. Could have been Philippi, but he's somewhere in Macedonia. That's the best that we can say. And he talks about how generous they were. I thought it was right here in chapter 9, where they first gave of themselves. I'm looking right at it, and I know it's here. Where is it? It's in chapter 8. They first gave of themselves. Yes, chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. If you don't know me, I got one of these bad habits of I know it's right there. I know it's right smack in front of me. Just ask my wife, she can tell you. They, talking about the Macedonians, They gave of their own means, according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they, the Macedonian Christians, gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Paul, when he writes 1 Corinthians, is where? Ephesus. Paul, when he writes 2 Corinthians, is where? Thessalonica, or Macedonia. And what does Paul say in 2 Corinthians about him coming? He says, I need you. What he's saying to them is, I'm coming. Verse 5 of 2 Corinthians 9. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you. So I've got some people who are bearing 2 Corinthians, and they're coming ahead in advance of the gift you promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift. What he's saying is, so that it'll be ready when I get there. Paul says, I'm in Macedonia, and I'm on my way to Corinth. That's what he says in 2 Corinthians. All right, so I did have it. There Paul writes 2 Corinthians from Thessalonica. While he is in Corinth, he has some time in Corinth, this next time in Corinth, and he writes what letter from Corinth? Romans. He sends the church to Rome from Corinth. Geographically, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? That's still a long way. Does Paul intend to go to Rome? You bet. Has he ever been to Rome as a preacher, as the gospel to the Gentiles? No. And he talks about that in that letter. I've never been there. And he does go on his fourth journey, his journey to Rome, which isn't really a journey per se, because he's a prisoner. He makes it, but is that the route you would have taken? What's going on here? What is that from the island of Crete over to the island of Malta? That's the shipwreck recorded in Acts chapter 27. How many chapters are in Acts? 28. So it's the next to last chapter. It's magnificent. Acts chapter 27 is one of the best accounts of nautical language from ancient times. 2,000 years old. You've got all this very specific terminology about ships. Those of you who served in the military, you know what aft is and all that, and stern and weighing anchor, and that doesn't mean much to me. I need to know right, left, front, back. Paul was on a ship. Luke writes all about that. He does make it to Rome. So far, we've talked about all the letters except for the prison letters. Let me go back. We haven't talked about the prison letters. When did Paul write Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon? When did he write the prison letters? We believe he wrote them while a prisoner in Rome. He couldn't go to those places, but he still wanted to be able to communicate with them. So Paul wrote the prison letters from Rome while a prisoner. And Philippians indicates, hey guys, I'm going to be released. What did it take? Paul's a prisoner. That's a whole other story in and of itself. What did it take for Paul to be released from prison the first time? He had appealed to Caesar. What does that mean? As a Roman citizen, that was his right. He's accused of some crimes by the Jews, and so he says, I appeal to Caesar. And what does that mean? He has an audience with Caesar Nero himself. Was Caesar Nero a friend to Christians? Absolutely not. And it is remarkable that Paul was released from prison the first time. When Acts ends, where is Paul? Is he released from prison? No, he's in prison. So what would that suggest to you? The book of Acts most likely was written before Paul was released from prison. And so it doesn't talk about Paul writing these last few letters. Most likely he wrote those 4 little letters, the prison letters, from prison. He is released, to the best of our understanding, the best of our knowledge. And while he is in Macedonia, he writes letters to Titus in Crete, and he writes 1st and 2nd Timothy to Timothy in Ephesus. And what does he say in those? Well, he writes 1 Timothy to Timothy in Ephesus. And what is he saying to these guys? I'm coming. In the meantime, if you could do some of these things that are so important to help these churches. While you're in Crete, Titus, while you're in Ephesus, Timothy, this is what I need you to do. I'm coming. I'm on my way. One of the most famous passages about this is 1 Timothy chapter 1. Marc. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, it's in chapter 3, verse 14. 1 Timothy 3, verse 14. I got to thinking about 1 Timothy 1, verse 15. I'm the least of all, or the chief of sinners. 1 Timothy 3, 14 and 15 says, I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you so that, if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. He's basically saying, Timothy, 1 Timothy is all about the church and how it should behave, how you should behave. And that's a good little thesis, we might say. Paul says, I'm going to be delayed. If I'm delayed, here's some instructions for you. And aren't you glad Paul was delayed? So that he could write 1 Timothy and Titus. And we have these little letters. Okay, so let's go back through these. Let's think about these. Where and when did Paul write Galatians? We don't know. But if it was early, he probably wrote it from Syria when he got back at the end of his first missionary journey before the Jerusalem Council, probably in Antioch of Syria. Paul then wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. What journey did he write them on? He didn't write any on his first journey. What journey did he write 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? The second journey. What other letters did Paul write on his second missionary journey? None. Acts 16 through 18. He didn't write any other letters. Where did Paul write 1st and 2nd Thessalonians from? Corinth. How long was he at Corinth in Acts 18? A year and a half. Okay. Let's jump to the third missionary journey. Where was Paul when he wrote 1 Corinthians? Ephesus. How long was he there? 3 years. 3 years. Acts 19. Going into Acts 19. And he does leave Corinth. He does leave Ephesus. He had planned to cross the Aegean, go directly to Corinth, but he goes up into Macedonia. So where does he write 2 Corinthians from? Macedonia. I had on the little map there Thessalonica, but we don't know for sure. He never says for sure where it was. All right. While he's in Macedonia and has written 2 Corinthians, he sends the letter. He sends some people to Corinth for what purpose? Before him, he sends them so that they can get the letter. And what's he wanting them to get ready for? Or get together? The collection. Paul is coming to pick up these funds. When Paul writes 1 Corinthians, he has to deal with some really difficult issues. In 2 Corinthians, what is Paul's reaction? What was the Corinthians' reaction to Paul's scathing 1 Corinthians letter? They repented. They made a lot of changes. When Paul writes 2 Corinthians, there's still issues. There's still some pretty serious conflict going on, but things are better between him and the Christians there. There's some Judaizing teachers he has to deal with. All right, where does Paul write Romans from? So he wrote 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. He goes up into Macedonia, writes 2 Corinthians, comes down to Corinth, and from Corinth he writes Romans. What is Paul doing with those funds? The collection that is being taken up, that he's written about in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians and Romans, what is he planning on doing with those funds? Taking them to Jerusalem. So that's what he does. He goes to Jerusalem, and when he is in Jerusalem, according to the book of Acts, what happens? He is arrested, nearly killed, and eventually makes his way to Rome. While in Rome, in prison, what does he write? The prison letters. Colossians and Philemon are probably first. Ephesians. And tell me about the connection between Ephesians and Colossians. How do we know they're written pretty close to each other? A lot of the same content. Where Colossians is briefer, Ephesians has a lot more information. And that's something that's, we call them these parallels between Ephesians and Colossians. They're not really parallels, but they're very similar. And you talking about, Colossae in Ephesus? Yes, in Asia Minor. A lot of times we talk about the churches in Revelation 1 through 3. One of those churches very well could have been Colossae, but it's not emphasized there. But Ephesians is the first of those letters. So there were other churches in Asia Minor, and Colossae was certainly one of them. All right, Philippians. Paul indicates in Philippians, hey, I'm going to be released. All right then. 1 Timothy and Titus, they are after Acts. I guess you could say the prison letters are too, but they are most definitely after Acts. And then 2 Timothy. When Paul writes 2 Timothy, where is he? What's his life situation? Probably in Rome, in prison. And there are the verses, 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 8. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering. The time of my departure has come. I'm going to die this time. I mean, if you stood before Nero Caesar the first time and you were released, what's the likelihood you're going to be released the second time? Pretty low. And where in the New Testament does it tell us that Paul was killed? It doesn't, but it's pretty well implied. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who love his appearing. This is a depressed, discouraged Apostle Paul who is looking back on his life and saying it was worth it. Serving the Lord was worth it. I'm here at the end, but that's okay. Verse 16. 2 Timothy 4, verse 16. At my first defense, he says, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them. What is that first defense referring to? His trial before Caesar Nero. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed to all the Gentiles, and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. Even though he's nearing the end of his life and he's had a lot of downs, he's still positive here at the end, isn't he? The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Isn't that a beautiful way to go out? And that's what Paul did when he wrote his final letter. All right. I hope that will jog our memory a little bit about Paul's letters, when he wrote them, where he was, and give us a leg up in our future study. If you're saying, I can't remember all that, well, again, that's what the book is for, to help. Is that a hand? Okay. You have the last word then. Yes, Sandy, if you could just do a little better and you're letting your light shine, that would be really good. We would appreciate that. No matter how hard we work, there's always more to do, and we appreciate your example and your words there as well. Paul, he's a huge encouragement. He's a huge impact on all of us, and we need to spend time reading his letters and seeing the passion, the problems he faced, the discouragement. But then he's also the one, you remember, who said, "If God be for us, who can be against us? All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." Some of the most magnificent literature you will ever read is the letters of the Apostle Paul. Thank you for studying with me, surveying his letters with me today.